The night the billionaire underestimated the wrong woman, the diner breathed with its usual tired rhythm. The hum of overhead lights mixing with the faint chatter of late-night regulars, but tonight, something felt heavier. As if the air itself sensed that two lives were about to collide in a way neither expected. Grace Miller moved between the tables with practiced steadiness, her dark hair tied into a neat bun, her face calm despite the exhaustion that hid behind her warm brown eyes. For most people who walked into this 24-hour roadside diner, she was simply a waitress, another nameless worker, in a wrinkled apron. Someone meant to serve and then fade into the background. But beneath that quiet smile lived a woman carrying a past brighter than anyone around her could imagine. Grace had once been the top economics student at Hamilton University, a rising star who could read market patterns the way musicians read notes. Her professors said she had a mind sharp enough to predict financial storms before anyone else even felt the wind. Yet life had an unkind way of shifting the path beneath people's feet. Her father's sudden heart attack, her mother's medical bills, and endless streams of debt had pushed her dreams into the background, forcing her into this diner, this worn-out space of endless coffee pots and sticky tables. Still, she held her head high each night. Even when life pressed hard against her spine, tonight the crowd was thin. Only a handful of truck drivers discussing long highways and weather warnings, and a teenager typing furiously on a laptop while drinking a milkshake that had melted into sweet soup. The air outside was cold, the kind of cold that made the neon sign flicker, so when the glass doors swung open and a gust of chilled wind swept in, Grace instinctively tightened her apron. Then she saw him, Richard, cross the billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers, business channels, and investment forums. His entry didn't just turn heads. It seemed to bend the entire room's energy toward him. Richard walked with a confidence sharpened by years of being told he was the smartest man in every room, the kind who wore power like a second skin. His navy suit looked impossibly expensive, his tie perfectly knotted, and his watch gleamed under the diner lights as if refusing to dim itself to match the place he'd stepped into. He always came around this time on Fridays, though nobody understood why a man with mansions, private chefs, and penthouses continued to visit a diner that smelled like burnt toast and grease. He rarely spoke, barely acknowledged anyone, and behaved as if the world outside his mind barely existed. Grace approached his booth with a calm she did not feel, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Richard didn't look up, his eyes fixed on his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that suggested he couldn't afford even a second wasted on the world around him. "Good evening, Mr. Cross," she said with gentle professionalism. "The usual tonight?" His voice was cold enough to frost glass. "Obviously. Just pour it." She kept her composure, though his tone struck her like a familiar bruise. As she filled his cup, she felt his eyes finally lift to meet hers, not with gratitude, but with curiosity edged in arrogance. It was the way someone might examine a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture. She turned to leave, but his voice, smooth yet laced with superiority, stopped her mid-step. "Tell me something, Grace. Don't you ever feel like you're wasting your life in this place?" The question hit harder than she expected. It wasn't the words, but the way he said them, as if he already believed he knew her story, her limitations, her worth. "Excuse me?" she asked, not out of confusion, but out of disbelief at his audacity. Richard leaned back, folding his arms, confidence dripping from every angle. "You're clearly not stupid. You speak well, you move with purpose, and you have that look in your eyes, the one people get when they're meant for something bigger. So why are you here serving coffee?" The diner grew quieter. Even the teenager with the laptop paused, sensing tension thick enough to slice. Grace forced a breath, keeping her voice steady. "Sometimes choosing responsibility over ambition doesn't make you lesser," she said. "It makes you human." But instead of softening, Richard smirked, as though her words were naive. "Humanity is overrated. Results are what matter, and I doubt this place provides any." She should have walked away. She should have let the comment slide as she had done with countless rude customers before him. But this man, this billionaire with a superiority complex, sparked something in her. Maybe it was the years of swallowed dreams, Maybe it was the exhaustion from struggle. Or maybe it was the quiet fire inside her that never truly died. So she said firmly, "You might be surprised what people like me are capable of." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Then prove it." He turned his laptop around, showing her a complex spreadsheet loaded with market volatility charts, risk analysis graphs, and layered investment structures that most analysts in his own company struggled to interpret. "This," he said coldly, "is my company's upcoming investment model. It's something my highest paid team hasn't fully cracked yet. If you're as sharp as you pretend, explain it to me." Grace stared at the screen. The numbers were dense, the patterns interwoven like threads in a tapestry. It was a trap. She could see that from the arrogant glint in his eyes. He expected her to fail, expected her to stumble, expected her to prove his assumptions right. And yet, despite that, something within her refused to look away. She leaned closer, ignoring the whispers from the few customers watching the scene unfold. She scanned the data with the practiced instinct of a woman who once excelled in economic modeling, her mind clicking through the layers, patterns, and hidden flaws Richard's team had overlooked. She let out a slow breath. "Your algorithm is misreading short-term volatility as long-term behavioral shift," she said quietly, but with confidence that made him stiffen. "The consumer trend you're predicting isn't sustainable past Q4. If you invest aggressively now, you might get a temporary spike, but the decline afterward will cost you more than you gain." Richard's expression shifted. Only slightly, but enough for her to see it, the flicker of surprise from a man not used to being corrected. She continued, now finding momentum, her voice steady and analytical. "You're also overvaluing asset resilience. Market confidence is artificially inflated right now because of the recent tech merger. Once the merger stabilizes, investors will pull back, causing a retraction in liquidity. If you don't reroute your growth model by at least 12%, your projections will collapse." The diner felt suspended in silence, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear her. Richard stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time, his arrogance faltering. She straightened, smoothing her apron. "If you're investing in long-term growth," she finished, "this model needs a complete recalibration." The mighty billionaire CEO was speechless. He blinked. Once, twice. His jaw clenched, not in anger, but in disbelief. Grace stepped back, reclaiming her composure, her heart pounding but her pride steady. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She simply needed him to know she was not the woman he thought she was. Richard swallowed hard, trying to recover his composure, leaning closer to the screen, scanning the same lines she had just interpreted with ease. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Who exactly are you?" And just like that, for the first time since he entered the diner, the billionaire realized he had underestimated the wrong woman. Asterisk when power realized. He didn't know everything for a long moment after the question left his mouth. Grace simply looked at him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the booth, her posture steady in a way that didn't match the uniform she wore. "I'm just a waitress, remember?" she replied, her tone calm but edged with quiet irony. Richard hated that answer more than any direct challenge because it refused the definition he had tried to place on her. He closed the laptop slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were trying to recalibrate an internal equation that no longer balanced. Before he could press further, the bell on the counter rang. The cook shouted that ordered tickets were piling up, and the spell broke. Grace stepped away to do her job, taking orders, delivering plates, refilling coffee cups, as though she hadn't just dissected a multi-million-dollar investment model in under 5 minutes. Yet Richard's gaze followed her every movement, watching her juggle responsibilities with a focus and grace his own executives often lacked. He noticed how she listened to each customer with sincerity, how she remembered small details, extra napkins for the trucker with shaky hands, an extra cherry for the teenager's milkshake, a kind word for the older woman sitting alone at the far end of the counter. It wasn't just intelligence he'd seen in her. It was something far rare, emotional awareness combined with analytical precision. Asterisk. Customers eventually trickled out, leaving the diner quieter, the clock edging closer to midnight. The college kid packed up their laptop. The truckers paid and left. And the only remaining customers were an older couple in the corner and Richard himself. Grace cleaned tables with the same care she applied to numbers, moving with an efficiency that had come from necessity, not choice. She could feel his eyes on her, and part of her wished she had said less. Kept her talent hidden, but another part, the tired, bruised, determined part, was glad she had let a piece of her truth surface. She didn't owe him an explanation, but for once, she had refused to let someone reduce her to a stereotype. When she finally returned to his booth to refill his now half-empty coffee cup, he didn't greet her with another insult or sarcastic comment. Instead, he studied her as though she were a complex chart he hadn't yet decoded. "Hamilton University, I'm guessing?" he asked quietly. She stiffened, surprised. "How did you?" He gave a small shrug. "Only a top-tier program would produce someone who can do what you just did in their head." "You mentioned economics earlier." Hamilton's been in the news for its analytics department. His tone was no longer mocking. It was something else, a mix of professional respect and personal confusion. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Graduated with honors. I had a fellowship lined up at a consulting firm, but my dad's heart attack happened 2 weeks before I was supposed to start. My mom couldn't keep up with the bills alone, so I stayed. Took any job I could. I've been here ever since." He listened, and to his own surprise, he didn't interrupt. "So you gave up a high-income career to make minimum wage and refill coffee?" he asked, more thoughtful than cruel this time. Grace met his gaze, her voice level. "I didn't give up anything. I delayed it. My family needed me, and I'm not ashamed of that. Money comes and goes. People don't." The simplicity of that sentence unsettled him more than any market analysis she'd offered. Richard Cross had spent his entire life believing that sacrifices were only worth making for profit, for empire building, for measurable returns. Personal sacrifice for the sake of another person, simply for love, without a clear gain, felt illogical, inefficient. And yet here she was, looking at him with eyes that held both pain and peace, as if she'd come to terms with something he was still running from. "Do you still follow the markets?" he asked, fingers idly tapping the side of his cup. She huffed a soft laugh. "I don't exactly have a Bloomberg terminal back there next to the ketchup bottles, but yes. I read reports on my phone on breaks, watch live streams when I can, study trends. Old habits don't die. They just wait in the dark for a chance to matter again." He mulled over her words, trying to reconcile the idea of a mind like hers buried in a place like this. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as a fluke, a lucky guess, but deep down he knew what he'd just seen was not luck. It was trained skill, sharpened by hardship. The question that had been forming in his mind finally pushed its way out. "What would you do," he asked slowly, "if you weren't here?" She blinked, then offered a small, almost wistful smile. "I'd be building something that mattered. Maybe not a giant tech empire like yours, but something that gave people like my parents a chance to breathe. A financial literacy program that didn't talk down to them. A platform to help people read their own numbers instead of being swallowed by them. A business where employees weren't treated like replaceable gears." Her eyes briefly flicked to his expensive watch. "Something that didn't confuse profit with worth." That last comment landed like a stone in his chest. Most people either flattered him or feared him. Very few held up a mirror. He didn't like what he saw in it. "You think that's what I do?" he asked quietly. "Confuse profit with worth?" Grace didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the couple in the corner, then at the cook wiping down the pass, and finally at the empty seats that held stories of people working 2 jobs. People paying for community college in cash, people sharing 1 burger between 3 kids. Then she looked back at him, a billionaire sitting alone in a booth, surrounded by wealth no one could see. "I think," she said carefully, "that somewhere along the way, you forgot that people are not numbers, and that if you only measure success by what shows up on a balance sheet, you'll never understand why someone like me would choose this place over abandoning the people I love." Silence settled between them again, not hostile this time, but heavy with unspoken history. Richard took a slow sip of coffee, more to buy time than out of thirst. You know nothing about me, he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Grace tilted her head slightly. True, but for someone who claims to understand the world, you seem strangely uninterested in the lives that don't look like yours. That stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it was uncomfortably accurate. He wanted to push back, to reassert control, to remind himself he was still the one with power. So he went back to what he knew best. Tests fine, he said, exhaling sharply. You think you could actually survive in my world? You think your theories would hold up when millions, billions of dollars are on the line? Grace didn't flinch. That's what you think this is about? Survival in your world. She shook her head slowly. You're asking the wrong question. The better one is, could your world survive if the people who actually understand what's happening walked away? His eyes narrowed slightly. What's that supposed to mean? She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. It means the people at the top often forget that they stand on structures built by those below them. If enough of us decide we're done holding things together for men who never learned respect, the whole tower falls. Asterisk, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, unease. It wasn't that she was threatening him. She wasn't. It was that she had articulated something he'd always sensed, but never acknowledged. His companies, his algorithms, his systems, none of them existed in a vacuum. They needed minds. They needed trust. They needed people. He had spent so long believing he could replace anyone who became inconvenient that he had forgotten some talents were not only rare, but irreplaceable. You talk like you've seen this before, he muttered. Grace's gaze grew distant. I have. My father worked for a corporation that treated him like a number. He gave them everything over time, weekends, holidays. They praised him when profits were up and fired him when the slightest dip came. No severance, no gratitude. Just a signature on a termination letter. 2 years later, he was gone. The stress didn't cause his heart attack alone, but it sure helped it along. Richard stared at her, at the steady way she delivered this piece of her life, not as a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact. I'm sorry, he said quietly, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his tone. Grace nodded once, accepting the apology, but not asking for more. Sorry doesn't pay medical bills, she said softly, but thank you. He felt a tug of something he didn't often feel for strangers. A reluctant, growing respect that his ego tried to suppress but could not fully extinguish. He drummed his fingers on the side of the booth again. I'll make you a deal, he said finally. Deals were his comfort zone. Deals made sense. They had terms, stakes, measurable outcomes. Come to my office tomorrow. I'll give you 1 hour. I'll put you in front of data that my senior team has been analyzing for weeks. If you can spot something they've missed and prove it, I'll pay you $5,000 on the spot. Grace's brows lifted slightly. $5,000 was more money than she made in several months of double shifts. She could feel the temptation wrap around her like a quick, warm breeze. But behind the warmth was a cold question. What did he really want? To test her? To use her? To entertain himself? Asterisk? And if I refuse? She asked. His smile returned, but it was less cruel than before, more curious. Then I finish my coffee, you finish your shift, and we go back to our separate worlds. You keep wiping tables, I keep building companies, and we pretend this conversation never happened. She crossed her arms loosely, her mind already calculating the risks. And if I go? If I pass your little test? She didn't say it mockingly, just honestly. His answer came without hesitation. Then I'll offer you a position. Not as a waitress, obviously. As an analyst. A real one. With a salary, benefits, health insurance, the things your father should have had. You'd be working with some of the brightest people in the industry. You'd finally use that degree for more than making conversation with strangers over coffee. He expected her to say yes immediately. Most people did when he dangled opportunity in front of them. But Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked, and what happens if I disagree with you in that world? If I tell you something you don't want to hear? Will you listen? Or will you just look for the next person to replace me? The question cut to the center of his leadership. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't have a ready-made answer. He was used to absolute obedience, to being the final word. But standing before him was a woman whose worth had nothing to do with his approval, and he knew instinctively that if he tried to control her, she would walk away without looking back. "I can't promise I'll always like what you say," he admitted, "but I can promise I'll hear it. And if you're right, I don't ignore what makes me money," was a half-honest answer, and they both knew it. Grace studied him for a long moment, trying to decide whether this was just another power game or a genuine opening. She thought of her mother sleeping in their small apartment, of unpaid prescriptions, of nights she'd gone without so her mother wouldn't have to. She also thought of the people in this diner, of the safety and routine they represented. Leaving wasn't as simple as just changing jobs. It meant stepping into a world built by a man who had just admitted he didn't fully understand people like her. She finally exhaled. "I can't just walk away from my shift tomorrow," she said. "I'm not like you. I don't disappear from responsibilities because something more interesting comes along." He nodded slowly. "Then bring your responsibilities with you. I'll send a car for you 2 hours before your shift starts. 1 hour at my office. Then you can still come here afterward."
Ow.
It was a practical solution, one that didn't require her to leap into the unknown without a safety net. She absorbed it, her mind turning the idea over from multiple angles. "Fine," she said at last, surprising herself with how steady she sounded. 1 hour. I'm not promising anything beyond that." Something like a real smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, small but genuine. 1 hour, he agreed. "I'll have my assistant call the diner tomorrow and confirm." She nodded once more, then turned away to wipe down the counter. As if they'd just settled an ordinary agreement, instead of setting the first brick in a path that could change both their lives. As he watched her move, something shifted inside Richard Cross, something he couldn't yet name. For years, he'd believed that brilliance could only be found in polished offices, at elite universities, in rooms where the floors gleamed and the windows overlooked skylines. Yet tonight, in a faded diner with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign, a woman in a worn apron had dismantled his model, challenged his values, and forced him to confront the thinness of the metric he'd used to judge the world. He stood up, left a tip far larger than usual, though still less than he now felt she was worth, and walked out into the cold night air. As the door closed with a soft jingle behind him, Grace watched from the corner of her eye, feeling an unfamiliar mix of apprehension and hope swirl in her chest. She didn't know exactly what awaited her in his marble-floored empire, but one thing was certain. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't just something that happened to her. It was something she might finally step toward on her own terms. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered as his car pulled away, but inside the diner, something had turned on, steady and bright, in the mind of a woman who might soon leave just a waitress behind, forever, and in the heart of a billionaire, who was about to learn that intelligence without humility is just another kind of ignorance waiting to be exposed. Asterisk. The 1 hour that shook an empire morning sunlight spilled over the city in soft gold, brushing glass towers and quiet streets with a glow that felt too gentle for the storm. Brewing within the headquarters of Cross Dynamics, the building itself stretched up from the ground like a monument to ambition. Cold steel, flawless windows, sharp edges that reflected the sky with a precision that matched the man who built it. Inside, however, the atmosphere vibrated with tension. Analysts hurried past one another with tablets in hand. Executives whispered urgently in corners, and assistants typed with frantic speed, all of them carrying the unspoken knowledge that something important was about to happen. Though none of them knew that the catalyst would be a woman from a diner, someone they had never seen, someone they would never have believed capable of shaking their untouchable structure. But Richard Cross knew, and despite his efforts to appear controlled, a faint edge of anticipation crept into his movements. Grace arrived exactly on time, stepping out of the sleek black car he'd sent with the same calm she used to carry trays at the diner. Her simple dark blue blouse and clean jeans contrasted sharply with the tailored suits around her, yet she walked through the marble lobby with a quiet confidence that made even the receptionist pause. She didn't look like she belonged in this world of glass and corporate power, and yet nothing about her seemed out of place. It was as if the space simply hadn't realized it had been built incorrectly. and her presence exposed every flaw in its design. She checked in at the front desk, received a visitor's badge, and waited near the elevator, the way one might wait for a storm to settle. She had barely slept the night before, her mind tangled in doubts, worries, and a thin thread of hesitant hope. But she refused to arrive looking shaken. She refused to let insecurity show. She had promised herself that this hour would not define her worth. It would simply give her the chance to exercise it. Richard appeared the moment the elevator doors slid open, wearing a charcoal suit that made him look even more severe than usual. But the moment he saw her, his expression shifted subtly, but enough for her to notice. Gone was the arrogance from the night before. In its place lingered an uneasy mixture of curiosity, respect, something he wouldn't admit even to himself, a hint of doubt about the beliefs he'd built his life around. "You came," he said quietly as he approached her. Grace gave a small nod. "I said I would." He motioned for her to follow him into the elevator, and as the doors closed, a silence filled the space, thick, but not uncomfortable. There were things neither of them knew how to say yet. They exited on the 42nd floor, where glass-walled meeting rooms glowed with soft light and employees moved with the stiff seriousness of people who feared making the slightest mistake. This was the floor where decisions worth billions were made, where data shaped futures, and where egos the size of mountains battled for dominance. Richard led her past rooms full of executives discussing quarterly reports, past desks where analysts typed furiously, past assistants carrying stacks of documents taller than textbooks. He could feel eyes on them, and her, more specifically. Whispers rose. Confusion spread. Who was she? Why had the CEO brought a woman who looked nothing like their world into their inner sanctum? Grace felt all of it, but none of it pierced her composure. She had spent years being underestimated. Today, it felt familiar enough to ignore. He stopped outside a private conference room, opened the door, and gestured for her to enter. The room was minimalist and imposing floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, sleek black table in the center, and a massive digital screen covering the far wall. Her heartbeat quickened, though her face remained neutral. This was a different battlefield than the diner, but a battlefield nonetheless. Richard set his laptop on the table and tapped a few keys. The screen lit up with a swirl of graphs, projections, and layered data grids. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't simplify. He didn't lower the difficulty. This was the raw, unpolished core of cross dynamics, the type of data only senior-level strategists ever saw. "Asterisk this," he said. "Stepping beside her is the analysis my entire team has been working on for 3 months. 4 of my best analysts are in the room next door right now, reviewing the latest draft." His jaw tightened faintly. They believe they've solved the problem. Grace studied the screen with deep focus. "And you don't." Richard gave a humorless half-smile. "Let's just say, after last night, I'm willing to question things I normally wouldn't." She inhaled slowly, grounding herself. This was not a test she needed to pass for him. It was one she needed to pass for herself, to reclaim a part of her she'd buried under exhaustion and responsibility. He motioned toward the table. "You have an hour. Take your time. If you want to ask me anything, ask. If you want silence, I'll stay silent." She appreciated that more than he realized. "Silence is good," she said gently. He nodded and stepped back, folding his arms and watching her with an intensity that felt both analytical and personal. Grace moved closer to the screen, letting her eyes absorb the labyrinth of data. She recognized structural patterns almost immediately, retive change anomalies, consumption regressions, predictive algorithms shaping outcomes with less precision than they pretended to offer. As she analyzed, her mind entered a familiar flow state, a deep immersion she hadn't experienced since university. The kind that made the world fade until only patterns, numbers, narratives, and hidden truths remained. She almost forgot he was there. 15 minutes passed before she spoke. "Your model is beautiful," she said, "but it's wrong." Richard felt something between dread and excitement pulse through him. "Explain." Grace stepped closer to the screen, tracing invisible lines in the air with her fingertips. "You're projecting future behavior based on past stability," she said. But the market you're analyzing isn't stable anymore. The underlying drivers have changed. She glanced at him. And your team didn't account for human behavior, the emotional patterns inside the data. He frowned slightly. Quantitative analysts don't deal in emotion. That's the problem, she replied. Markets are made of people. People react out of fear, hope, uncertainty, desperation, pride. Those emotional reactions create ripples. You can't model unless you acknowledge them. That struck him harder than the mathematical corrections she pointed out next. She highlighted several misalignments in his teams, projection curves, small deviations his analysts had dismissed, but which she recognized as the early signs of a market pivot. She pointed out the false positives, predicted where fear-driven retraction would occur, and outlined how the model could collapse under unexpected pressure from a consumer shift that most economists wouldn't see until it was too late. With every observation she made, Richard's expression tightened, not out of anger, but because he understood she wasn't guessing. She was seeing, interpreting, uncovering. Your team's solution focuses on maximizing risk, she said, but the market is whispering caution. Not loudly, not yet. But if you act on this model, you'll lose millions in the long term, maybe billions. You need to shift strategy completely. She traced a different path across the screen. This is your only sustainable direction. Richard stared at her, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. He had expected her to identify a minor flaw, maybe offer a clever insight, something he could easily praise or dismiss. But this was an overhaul of the entire system. You don't understand, he said finally, voice low. My team has 30 years of combined experience. They have advanced degrees, specialized training, six-figure salaries, and sometimes, she interrupted gently, people who have been doing something a long time start seeing what they expect instead of what's really there. He had no counterargument. None, Grace continued, unaware of how deeply she had unsettled him. You built a strong company, she said softly, but you hired people who think in straight lines. You need someone who sees curves, someone who can read beyond the surface. She stepped back, letting the last graph settle on the screen. She was breathing a little heavier now, not from fear, but from the intensity of concentration. The room seemed brighter around her, as if the morning sun had chosen this exact moment to illuminate her determination. Richard spoke again. But his voice was different, quieter, almost reverent. Grace, do you realize what you just did? She looked at him, her expression steady. I analyzed the data. That's what you asked? He shook his head slowly. No, you rewrote the foundation of a strategy my company has spent months building. You solved a problem my best people couldn't solve. He exhaled sharply. You didn't just pass the test. You surpassed anyone I've ever put in this room. Yeah. A flicker of uncertainty passed through her eyes. I'm not looking for praise, she said softly. I just told you the truth the numbers were telling me. But he wasn't listening to his own pride anymore. He was listening to the reality he could no longer ignore. Grace, he said firmly, I want you on my team. Immediately. Whatever you're earning at the diner, multiply it by 20. Health insurance. Full benefits. A private office if you want one. And you won't be under anyone's thumb. You'll report to me directly. She blinked in shock. Richard, my mom still needs me. I can't just abandon the diner. I owe them notice then. Keep working there part-time if you must, he said quickly. I'll adjust your hours. I'll create a hybrid role, whatever it takes. I don't compromise on talent. Grace's heart raced, not out of excitement but fear. Fear of stepping into a world she had once lost the chance to join. Fear of failing. Fear of leaving the routine she knew so well. But there was also something else, a rising spark inside her chest. A reminder of who she used to be. Of the brilliance she had buried under obligation. Let me think, she said quietly. He nodded immediately. Take the day. Take a week. Take whatever time you need. She had expected pressure, but he offered none. That alone paradoxically pressured her more than anything else could have. She turned toward the window, her eyes sweeping the city. She imagined her father sitting at their small kitchen table years ago, telling her she had the kind of mind that could reshape the world. She imagined her mother's soft smile, the one she used to give when Grace won academic awards. She imagined all the dreams she had put on hold, and she imagined the risk of stepping forward now. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled not with weakness, but with the weight of a decision forming inside her. "If I do this," she said slowly, "it won't be because I owe you anything, and it won't be because I need saving." She looked back at him, her eyes steady, fierce, alive. "It will be because I chose myself." He didn't breathe for a moment. "Then choose yourself," he whispered. For once, the hour ended not with a handshake, not with a contract, not with a decision, but with two people standing in a room filled with data and sunlight, both of them aware that something irreversible had already begun. Grace returned to the elevator, her mind swirling with possibilities, doubts, hopes, and the echoes of a brilliance she once believed the world would never see again. Richard remained in the conference room long after she left, staring at the screen, knowing that his entire empire had just shifted, and that the woman who caused it still had no idea how far her influence might reach. She stepped out into the lobby, the visitor badge cool against her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt something bloom inside her. Not promises, not certainty, but potential, real potential. The kind that doesn't ask permission, it arrives quietly and waits for you to be brave enough to claim it. And somewhere high above the city, the billionaire who once defined himself by power realized, with surprising clarity, that he had just witnessed the arrival of someone who might one day change everything, not just for him, but for an entire industry built on the illusion that brilliance only lives in boardrooms. Grace Miller walked out the front doors and into the sunlight, unaware that her choice, whatever it would be, had already shaken an empire. Asterisk. The day the empire whispered her name, the next 48 hours, felt like a strange in-between world for Grace. A space suspended somewhere between the life she had lived for years and the life she was suddenly being offered. She moved through her diner shifts with the same steady grace she always had, but internally, everything had shifted. The simple clatter of plates, the low hum of customers, the hiss of the coffee machine, all the sounds she once associated with routine, now felt like echoes of a world she was halfway out of. Even the regulars noticed something different in her. There was a light behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, vibrant tension that suggested she was fighting with a decision too big to fit inside her small-town uniform. She didn't speak of the offer to anyone except her mother, who listened quietly from her armchair, her frail hands folded in her lap, her face warm with pride but shadowed with concern. "Grace," her mother said gently, "after hearing the full story, your life has been on hold for mine for far too long. If the world is finally giving you a door, maybe it's time for you to walk through it." Grace's throat tightened because the encouragement came not from a place of pushing, but from a place of love, a love that understood sacrifice, a love that didn't want her to shrink herself anymore. But fear lingered in her chest like something alive. Her mother's health was fragile, their finances unstable, their life precariously balanced. It wasn't as simple as grabbing an opportunity. It was about ensuring safety during the leap. Still, as she lay awake the night after the offer, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock, replaying every moment in Richard's office, she realized something profound. She had already stepped toward that future the moment she walked into that conference room. She had already crossed an invisible threshold by daring to show her abilities. And deep inside her heart, she knew she wouldn't be able to return to a life of pretending her mind was smaller than it was. The next morning, with her decision resting heavy but clear inside her, she dialed the number Richard had given her. He picked up on the second ring, his voice clipped, controlled, but with an unmistakable thread of anticipation woven through it. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice steady. There was a pause longer than she expected before he responded. "Good," he said finally, but the single word carried more emotion than he intended. "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll start with your orientation." She hung up the phone with shaking fingers and a heart that fluttered somewhere between fear and exhilaration. For the rest of the day, she moved quietly, letting the reality settle inside her like a new rhythm she would need to learn. She gave her 2 weeks' notice to the diner manager, who stared at her with wide eyes before pulling her into a tight hug. "You deserve better than this place, Grace," he said, voice thick. "Go show the world who you are." Morning arrived with the soft glow of hope and the sharp sting of anxiety. Grace stood before the towering Cross Dynamics building once again, this time without the protective shield of being a visitor. Today, she was entering as an employee. She wore a simple but elegant blouse, her hair pulled back neatly, her nerves arranged behind a carefully cultivated calm. As she crossed the marble lobby, something curious happened. People looked at her differently. It wasn't recognition, but rather the instinctive awareness people have when someone carries themselves with purpose. She stepped into the elevator and ascended to the floor that would become her new world. When the doors opened, she found Richard waiting for her near his office, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, except for the faintest glimmer of relief. "Welcome to Cross Dynamics," he said. She offered a small, professional smile. "Thank you." But the moment he introduced her to the team, the atmosphere in the department shifted dramatically. Dozens of analysts, men and women armed with degrees, experience, and resumes polished to mirror shine, looked at her with undisguised skepticism. Their faces tightened, eyes narrowed, and whispers flowed like currents through the room. A waitress? A diner girl? Handpicked by the CEO? It unsettled them in a way that no corporate directive ever had. Because they saw something they didn't understand. They saw someone who didn't fit their hierarchy. They saw a disruption. Richard noticed the reaction, but ignored it with the ease of a man accustomed to bending environments to his will. He led her to a spacious office, not luxurious, but undeniably respectable, with large windows overlooking the city. For a moment, she stood quietly at the doorway, staring at the polished desk, the high-backed chair, the shelves waiting to be filled, and something inside her cracked open. For years, she had balanced trays, wiped tables, carried the burdens of responsibility on her narrow shoulders. And now, here she was in a place designed for her mind, not her manual labor. She took a slow, grounding breath, letting the magnitude of the change wash over her. "I hope this will be comfortable for you," Richard said from behind her. She turned, meeting his gaze. "It's more than I ever expected." His eyes softened for a brief second, a fleeting vulnerability quickly masked by professionalism. "You earned it," he replied simply. With that, he left her to settle in, giving her space she didn't know she needed. It took her only a few moments to begin letting her mind transform the office into her own. She organized the desk, opened the laptop assigned to her, and allowed herself to imagine what her future might look like here. Her assignments began immediately: complex financial models, strategy forecasts, economic simulations that required not only intelligence, but intuition. And with each task she completed, something extraordinary happened. She excelled. Her insights were sharper than expected, her predictions more accurate, her analytical skill unmatched by anyone in the department. But what made her truly formidable wasn't the technical brilliance alone. It was her ability to understand the subtle interplay of human behavior within the data. She saw patterns others overlooked, anticipated decisions based not just on logic, but on psychology. She didn't just analyze markets. She understood them. Yet the very talent that drew Richard to her also sparked resentment among others. Analysts whispered behind glass partitions, questioning her qualifications, her background, her place among them. Some accused her of favoritism. Some dismissed her success as coincidence. Others simply refused to believe a woman with a waitress's past could surpass them. But Grace didn't crumble. She didn't retreat. She sat through meetings with her shoulders square and her voice calm, defending her projections with facts so precise that even the most seasoned strategists couldn't argue. She didn't fight for validation. She let her work speak, and it was louder than any of their doubts. Richard observed everything. He saw the tension among his team, the jealousy of those threatened by her talent, the whispered conversations that stopped the moment she walked into the room. But he also saw Grace's composure, her refusal to be reduced, her quiet, unshakable confidence. And though he had built his life on logic, he found himself admiring her more than data could explain. There was a strength in Grace that he had never seen, not in boardrooms, not in executives, not in any of the people who surrounded him daily. A strength forged in hardship, softened by compassion, hardened by necessity, and sharpened by brilliance. It became impossible for the rest of the company not to notice her. In meetings, she offered insights that redirected entire divisions. In reports, she identified risks no one had seen until she made them undeniable. And soon, quietly at first, then more boldly, executives began whispering her name not with skepticism anymore, but with a growing sense of respect. The empire had begun to take her seriously. But as her influence grew, so did the scrutiny. The higher she rose, the more her past came into question. And the more her past came into question, the more determined certain people became to find a flaw in anything that could justify their discomfort with her. Brilliance. The tension reached its peak one afternoon when Grace presented a major analysis to the board, an analysis that contradicted Richard's long-standing direction. Her voice was steady, her data unquestionable, her conclusions bold. The room fell into stunned silence when she finished. Not because she was wrong, but because she was rightened, because her projection required rewriting a strategy Richard himself had championed. The board members turned to him, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to correct her, waiting for the CEO to reassert authority. But Richard didn't speak. He didn't defend his idea. He didn't indulge his pride. Instead, he looked at Horelli, looked at her, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. For the first time in his entire career, he let someone else's truth stand over his own. And in that moment, the room shifted. So did the future. Grace didn't know it yet. But that meeting marked the beginning of a storm she didn't create but would soon be forced to endure. A storm of ego, resentment, power plays, and corporate politics. And behind it, someone was watching her success with growing bitterness. Someone who wasn't willing to let a former waitress rise any higher. Someone who would do anything to see her fall. But Grace Miller, with her quiet brilliance and unwavering integrity, was not a woman easily pushed off a path she had finally chosen. And soon, the entire company would learn that underestimating her would be the greatest mistake they ever made. Asterisk the fall they planned. The rise she chose, the storm that had been brewing within Cross Dynamics, did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded quietly at first, in the subtle tightening of smiles, the strained politeness in hallways, the sharp glances exchanged behind glass walls whenever Grace walked by. The company's old guard, the analysts and executives who had built their careers on seniority, rather than skill, felt her rising influence like a cold wind creeping through a closed room. They couldn't understand how someone with no corporate pedigree, no elite internship record, no polished resume, and no carefully crafted LinkedIn narrative could walk into their world and outthink them. It was an insult to their pride, a threat to their comfort, and worst of all, a mirror reflecting their complacency. And when people feel threatened, they do not always rise. They often choose to drag someone else down. It began with murmurs, then whispers, then subtle sabotage. A few analysts accidentally deleted portions of shared data she was working on. Someone switched meeting times without informing her. A senior strategist leaked a rumor that Grace was only successful because Richard was infatuated with her, dripping with jealousy and insecurity. Grace noticed every shift, every cold shoulder, every forced smile that didn't reach the eyes. She had seen it before in her father's workplace, how people turn vicious when they sense their authority slipping. But she did not flinch. She did not cling to anger or panic. She met their pettiness with quiet endurance. Her strength rooted not in arrogance, but in a resolve forged by years of hardship. She reminded herself that she hadn't come here for them. She had come here for her mother, for the promise of a future her father would have been proud of, and for the parts of herself she had almost given up on. But the true blow came unexpectedly sharp, calculated, and perfectly timed. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Just as Grace was preparing to present a refined, predictive model that could steer the company safely through an impending economic downturn. The board had called for an emergency review due to rumors of instability in the tech sector. Richard trusted her analysis fully, but he insisted she presented herself, a sign of confidence that only made her enemies more determined to see her fall. When she arrived at the boardroom, however, the atmosphere was unnervingly tense. The long, polished table gleamed under the recessed lights, but the air felt colder, as if the room itself braced for conflict. Several board members avoided her eyes. Others looked openly displeased. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, too controlled, too still. Her heart tightened. Something was wrong. She stepped forward to set up her presentation, but before she could begin, a board member cleared his throat. "Ms. Miller," he said, his tone stiff with forced professionalism, "before you proceed, there is an issue we must address. It has come to our attention that a significant portion of the data used in your analysis contains inconsistencies, some of them severe." Grace's breath caught. "Inconsistencies," she repeated. "There must be a misunderstanding. All of my data was pulled directly from another executive," cut her off sharply. "From restricted databases you were not authorized to access." She felt the accusation like a punch. "That's not true," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I was given access by Mr. Cross himself." But they ignored her. Another board member pushed a set of printed documents forward. "Furthermore, we have discovered unauthorized logins under your name in the early hours of several mornings. These logins extracted proprietary information outside of approved channels." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She knew instantly what had happened. Her credentials had been used, her trust weaponized, her integrity stolen and twisted. She tried to speak, but the room had already turned against her. Richard finally leaned forward, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying authority. "Let her explain." The board members exchanged uneasy looks, but they nodded. Grace inhaled deeply. She stood straighter, lifted her chin, and looked each of them in the eye. "I did not access anything illegally," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I did not manipulate data. I did not break protocol. Someone used my credentials without my knowledge. Someone who knew how to replicate my patterns." A ripple of discomfort spread across the room. But the board had already decided something long before she arrived. They wanted a scapegoat. And she was the most convenient target. "We cannot base decisions on speculation," one member said curtly. "The evidence is flawed," Richard cut in sharply. "Circumstantial and suspiciously convenient?" Turned his gaze toward the board, its voice gaining an edge Grace had never heard directed at anyone other than business rivals. "You're accusing the one person who identified every flaw your senior analysts overlooked. If she were dishonest or incompetent, we would not be sitting on profitable forecasts right now." The room shifted, tension rising in thick, almost tangible waves. Someone tried to counter, but Richard silenced them with a single look. Still, the board was relentless. "Her background is unconventional," one member ventured. "A former waitress suddenly rising to this level, it raises questions." Grace's chest tightened with indignation, but she kept her expression calm. Richard's eyes darkened with anger. "Her background is irrelevant. Her work speaks for itself." But even as he defended her, she could sense something breaking beneath the surface. Something in him. Something in the board. Something in the company that was bigger than them all after almost an hour of accusations and defensive arguments. The board demanded immediate action. They wanted a full investigation. They wanted her suspended. They wanted her removed before her presence destabilized corporate trust. Richard fought them harder than she ever expected. His voice grew sharper, his arguments more precise and pointed. He reminded them of her achievements, her accuracy, her contributions. But the board didn't want logic, they wanted control. And they saw her brilliance as a threat to that control. Finally. In a decision that felt like a knife twisting between her ribs, they voted. Not to fire her, not to punish her permanently, but to suspend her pending the outcome of a formal audit, a polite corporate way of stripping her of dignity while maintaining the illusion of fairness. Richard's face was carved from stone. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, each word edged with steel. "A grave mistake." But he couldn't stop them, not alone, not today. Grace stood there, hands clasped in front of her, her heart aching but her mind astonishingly clear. She realized then that this was the same system that had crushed her father, the same environment that devoured the vulnerable and protected the comfortable, and yet she didn't crumble. Not this time, not here, not in front of them. She took a slow breath and nodded once. "I understand," she said softly. "I'll comply with the investigation." She gathered her things silently while the boardroom buzzed with discomfort, guilt, and false triumph as she reached the door. Richard stepped toward her. "Grace," he said, his voice low, strained and carrying an emotion he rarely allowed anyone to hear, "don't lose faith. I will fix this. I promise you." She met his gaze steady, strong, unwavering. "I don't need you to fix it," she said gently. "I need the truth to come out, and it will." With that, she walked out of the room with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered far worse storms than corporate politics. Her suspension spread through the company within hours. Some whispered that she had been framed. Others rejoiced quietly, thinking the threat was gone. But one person, one analyst, hiding behind a polished facade, watched her departure with a twisted satisfaction. He was the one who had stolen her login, manipulated her data, fed the board half-truths, wrapped in deception. His name was Saul Rivington, one of the senior strategists she had outperformed. A man whose fragile ego could not withstand the idea of being overshadowed by someone younger, smarter, and from a background he deemed inferior. He thought he had one. He thought she would disappear quietly. He thought she was just a waitress playing genius. He was wrong. Grace spent the next week calmly documenting everything timestamps. Login anomalies, inconsistencies she had noticed earlier, but dismissed as simple glitches. She pored over her digital footprints, cross-checked her access logs, and traced patterns with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't need permission to seek the truth. She only needed time. And when she finally uncovered the trail that pointed directly to Saul's access patterns, his unauthorized transfers, the way he piggybacked on her credentials during her break, hours she packaged everything into a flawless report. Then she walked into Cross Dynamics without an appointment, without hesitation, and placed the report directly on Richard's desk. When he read the contents, his face went white, then red with fury, true visceral fury that shook even his controlled demeanor. "He did this," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with anger. "He framed you. He risked millions. He needed to believe he was irreplaceable," Grace finished softly. "People like him often do." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair sliding back with a harsh scrape. "Grace, this changes everything." She lifted a hand to stop him. "No," she said. "This time, let the truth speak. Not power, not anger. Truth." He froze, staring at her, realizing she wasn't just brilliant. She was principled in a way he had never been. He called the board to an emergency meeting. It lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Saul Rivington walked out of the building with security escorting him. Stripped of his position, reputation, career, Grace was reinstated immediately with a public apology. But Richard did something more. He offered her a promotion, senior analyst, leading her own division. A salary beyond anything she had imagined. A future she had once believed she'd forfeited. She accepted with quiet humility, understanding the weight of what she had fought for. Not just a job, but her dignity. In the months that followed, Grace reshaped Cross Dynamics from the inside. She implemented ethical data practices, trained rising analysts with compassion and high standards, and built models that saved the company millions. Her influence grew not because she chased power, but because she embodied integrity. And slowly, the company changed around her. Even the board learned to listen. As for Richard, he found himself transformed by her presence. Not romantically alone, but fundamentally. Grace challenged him, softened edges he didn't know existed, forced him to confront parts of himself he had buried beneath ambition. And with time, he became a better leader, a better listener, a better man. But Grace never forgot who she was or where she came from. She visited the diner often, not for nostalgia, but to remind herself that greatness doesn't come from titles or corporate towers. It comes from character. From the courage to rise even when the world expects you to stay small. And every time she walked through the glass doors of Cross Dynamics, employees straightened, whispered her name with respect, and stepped aside, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Because she had risen without stepping on others. Because she had succeeded without losing her soul. Because she had proven that brilliance doesn't need permission to shine. Grace Miller, the woman they mocked, doubted, underestimated, became the mind that rebuilt an empire. Not with arrogance, not with power games, but with truth. And the truth, once revealed, always wins.